At the beginning of the 20th century, anyone walking the streets of Danbury, Connecticut would have crossed paths with men whose hands trembled, unable to properly hold a glass or sign their own name. Some slurred their words as if they were drunk, even without having touched a drop. Others lost their teeth far too early, or went through episodes of extreme nervousness, almost panic, with no apparent cause. Seen on their own, they just seemed unlucky, or in poor health. The thing is, there weren't just a few of them. There were hundreds, and year after year more similar cases turned up, in different neighborhoods, in different families, with no obvious connection between them at first glance. Doctors noted the symptoms, neighbors talked, but for a long time, no one managed to put the pieces together. And when someone finally stopped to ask what those people had in common, the answer was always the same. They all worked with hats. More specifically, they all spent hours a day inside the factories that had made Danbury the most famous city in the United States in that trade. What nobody knew yet was just how much that job, so ordinary and so respected, was silently taking its toll. To understand the size of the problem, you first need to understand the size of the city. Danbury started small. In 1780, craftsman Zadok Benedict opened the first workshop there, with just 3 employees making 18 hats a week. But the business took off fast. By 1800, the city was producing 20,000 hats a year, more than any other place in the country. By 1820, that output was coming from 28 factories spread across the area. At the turn of the 20th century, Danbury was at its peak, about 30 factories in operation, producing close to 5 million hats a year, something like a quarter of all finished hats sold in the United States, and 3/4 of the hat bodies used to make them. The city earned the nickname Hat City of the World, and it wasn't an exaggeration. More people worked making hats there than in any other trade in the region combined. Entire families depended on those factories, generation after generation. It was a source of pride, of livelihood, of identity. And, without anyone knowing it yet, it was also a silent risk, present in every single shift. On the downtown streets, among the shops and churches, you'd pass the same unsteady, slurring men who opened this story. Only there, right inside the very city that supported them, no one was sure what was behind it. It was exactly that contrast, a thriving city harboring such widespread suffering, that got doctors' attention. The strange part is that they'd already suspected something since 1860, when the problem was first described in American medical publications, still with no definitive explanation behind it. But suspecting isn't the same as proving. Between the 1880s and 1890s, the Connecticut Board of Health went as far as monitoring Danbury's factories, without taking any firmer action, since the problem seemed limited to the workers themselves and didn't affect the rest of the population. It wasn't until the turn of the 20th century that the investigation really gained momentum, driven not by doctors, but by the hatters themselves, organized into unions since 1880, and tired of watching co-workers fall ill with no clear answers. In 1913, that still unexplained ailment was written into the state's workers' compensation law, a still modest but real acknowledgement that something inside the factories was making the workers sick. In 1919, the Connecticut state government went further and officially declared it a disease tied to the hat-making trade. The problem finally had legal recognition, statistics, urgency. All that was missing was for someone to actually discover what, inside those factories, was causing so much damage. Before reaching the exact cause, the first obvious suspect came up: the factory environment itself. Heat, steam, 10 to 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, enclosed, stuffy rooms, often with little ventilation. It made sense to blame the exhaustion, the grueling routine, the relentless pace of production. And indeed, all of that made the workers' suffering worse, leaving them more vulnerable, more exposed. But the more investigators looked, the more they realized that wasn't enough of an explanation. Other factories of the era also had long shifts and rough conditions, without producing the same pattern of symptoms. There was something more specific getting into those men's bodies, day after day, something that didn't come from the heat or the fatigue, but from one very particular step in the process. It came from a liquid used right at the start of production, when rabbit pelts and those of other small animals were prepared to be turned into felt, an orange-colored liquid, almost harmless looking, that the hatters themselves handled with their bare hands, with no idea what it actually carried. It had been there for generations, so common in the factory routine that almost no one paid it any attention anymore. The process was called carroting, named that way precisely because of the orange color it left on the treated pelts. It involved dipping the animal hides in a chemical solution to separate the fur from the skin and get the fibers ready to bond into felt. So far, no visible danger, just one more step among many in the production line. The problem started later, when the formed felt had to be shaped with hot steam in the hat-blocking stage. By heating that already treated material, the workers breathed in, shift after shift, year after year, the vapor released from it, mixed with the heat and humidity of the room. And it was exactly that invisible vapor, without a strong smell, without a noticeable taste, that slowly built up inside their bodies, settling into the nervous system little by little, silently, until the first signs appeared. The body began to change in almost imperceptible ways, and that's where these men's story gets harder to hear. The first signs were subtle, almost trivial. A slight tremor in the fingers while holding a cup, a new difficulty buttoning one's own shirt, a tiredness that rest didn't fix. Many ignored it, blamed it on age, on the cold, on a bad night's sleep. But the tremor didn't go away. It got worse month after month until it became visible to anyone on the street. Hands shaking non-stop, even at rest, even when the man tried, with all his willpower, to keep them still. His speech changed too. It grew slurred, hesitant, as if every word had to be pushed out of his mouth. Then came the excess saliva, the teeth that loosened and fell out before their time, often with no visible pain, just the body slowly giving way. But what surprised the doctors of that era most wasn't the body, it was the mind. Men known for being talkative, sociable, present in neighborhood life, started shutting themselves off. They avoided gatherings, avoided eye contact with strangers, felt a shame they couldn't explain. This extreme shyness, this quiet withdrawal from one's own social life, even had a name among doctors: erethism, a kind of emotional short circuit caused by the very poison lodged in the nervous system. In more advanced stages came irritability for no reason, sudden mood swings, episodes of confusion, and, in the most severe cases recorded in the medical literature of the time, hallucinations and bouts of deep despair. It wasn't madness in the everyday sense of the word. It was the brain reacting, little by little, to decades of exposure that no one had ever chosen. Outside the factory walls, each of these symptoms took its toll. Neighbors who passed a hatter stumbling on the sidewalk, slurring his words, assumed he was drunk, not sick. Some men lost friendships over it, lost the trust of people who didn't understand what was really going on. At home, the problem was even more concrete. A worker whose hands wouldn't stop shaking could no longer do the fine, precise work the trade demanded, and no output meant no pay. Entire families, who for generations had lived off the same trade, watched the main breadwinner lose the ability to support the household, in the very profession that had put bread on the table for their parents and grandparents. Some younger hatters, seeing what happened to the older men in the very factories where they worked, knew exactly what awaited them down the road, but there was rarely any other job to be had in a city built entirely around a single industry. It was stay and get sick, or leave and lose your livelihood. That was the quiet choice Danbury forced on its own workers, generation after generation, without most of them ever knowing the exact name of what was consuming them from the inside. The definitive answer didn't come from the factory floor, it came from the laboratory. That orange liquid used in carroting was a solution of mercuric nitrate, a compound that once vaporized by heat was absorbed through the worker's lungs and skin, gradually building up in the body over the years. In 1922, physician and researcher Alice Hamilton, a pioneer in occupational health studies at Harvard, examined 100 unionized Danbury hatters, one by one, cataloging their symptoms and work history. The results were published 3 years later by the Workers' Health Bureau of America. 43 of those 100 men showed clear signs of mercury poisoning, practically 1 in every 2. Another researcher, Charles Edward Amory Winslow, of Yale University, reached similar conclusions studying a separate group of 100 workers, reinforcing that this was no coincidence and no exaggeration. The culprit finally had a chemical name, a medical explanation, and was no longer just a rumor passed around among workers on the factory floor. Science had finally caught up to what the hatters themselves had felt in their bodies for generations. Even with the proof in hand, it took nearly 2 decades for the change to move off the page. Unions, doctors, and reformers pressured manufacturers throughout the 1920s and 1930s, among them activist Grace Mailhouse Burnham, who even sought out a non-toxic alternative to the carroting process, without managing to convince manufacturers to adopt it. Meanwhile, the United States Public Health Service was negotiating with unions and industries across 26 states to bring a permanent end to the use of mercury in hat making. On December 1, 1941, Connecticut Governor Robert Hurley officially announced a ban on mercury in the process, replaced by hydrogen peroxide, a safer alternative for workers. For many years afterward, Danbury's hatters celebrated that date as a kind of anniversary of their own survival, a victory won after generations of silent suffering. But the mercury never truly disappeared. Decades later, it can still be found in the soil where the factories once stood and in the sediment of the Still and Housatonic rivers, silent proof of a poison that, even once banned, never fully left the place where it began. Even without mercury, Danbury's hat industry never regained the strength it once had. Starting in the 1920s, the number of factories was already declining, worn down by labor disputes and competition. By the 1950s, only one factory was still running in the city, the Danbury Rough Hat Company, and fashion had shifted too. The automobile replaced walking and the streetcar, and fewer men felt the need to leave the house wearing a hat. The city's last hat factory closed its doors in December 1987, bringing more than 2 centuries of tradition to an end. Today, Danbury no longer lives off hat making. The city has reinvented itself as a hub for electronics, machinery, and other industries, and is home to corporate headquarters that relocated from the New York area starting in the 1970s. Even so, the past hasn't been forgotten. On the streets of the historic downtown, you can still visit the John Dodd Hat Shop, a store dedicated to preserving the memory of the local hat trade, along with the Danbury Museum and a statue honoring the city's old-time hatters. What remains, beyond the museums and historical markers, is that same invisible trace, the mercury that still turns up today in soil and sediment samples around the city, a chemical reminder of a time when Danbury dressed the world, while quietly hiding, within itself, a price its own workers paid in silence. Danbury moved on, reinvented itself, became a different city. But the story of its hatters remains an important reminder of how progress sometimes hides a cost that only shows up years later, etched into the bodies of the very people who worked to build it. Stories like this deserve to be told with care, without exaggeration, and without sensationalism, respecting what these people actually went through. That's the commitment of this channel, to investigate real stories and tell them responsibly. If this work means something to you, consider subscribing to the channel to follow the next investigations. And if you'd like to continue this journey, there's another real, equally well-documented case in the video on your screen right now.